Industrialization and Reaction, Part 2. Workers in the Age of Social Darwinism. Conditions for workers during the Gilded Age were almost indescribably bad. It was not uncommon for workers to put in 12 or 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, or even 7 days a week. None of the conveniences and privileges that modern workers have existed at that time. There was no workman's compensation, there were no sick days or vacation days. If you were injured on the job, more than likely there was nothing to help you during that period. Workers put in long hours under very dangerous and repetitive conditions. This was long before anything like carpal tunnel syndrome was thought to exist, and so workers were often put to repeat the same task over and over and over again, hour after hour, day after day. Conditions in many occupations were incredibly dangerous in that era as well. We described in the previous lectures the advantages that big business possessed at that time. There was virtually no government regulation, no safety rules, or any limitations on industry at that time. They put their workers to work in very dangerous conditions because it was cheaper for them and they made greater profits. Many different occupations included and involved dangerous and unpleasant working conditions. In the numerous textile mills, women and children would be covered in little fragments of cotton and bits of cloth as the day went on, and frequently they suffered with various kinds of lung ailments. The railroads involved all kinds of hazardous working conditions. One of the most dangerous jobs during that era was to be a brakeman. At that time, the brakeman on the trains had to climb up onto the roof of the car and turn a wheel or pull a latch of some sort in order to apply the brakes on that one car. Meantime, the rest of the train continued moving, and so it was very common for these workers to fall off the train or be crushed in between the cars or under the wheels of the train. Loggers on the rivers worked in incredibly hazardous conditions as massive log jams clogged the rivers, and the workers would be down there standing on the logs trying to dislodge the jam. And if they fell into the water, more than likely they would be crushed between the logs or drowned underneath. And among the harshest conditions were those in the numerous laundries at that time. Often these were immigrant workers, and most often Chinese immigrants working in the laundry. They worked all day, and frequently more than one day in a shift, with their hands and arms submerged in dirty, soapy water. They suffered from all kinds of unpleasant swelling and ulcers and skin ailments during that time, to say nothing of the long, tedious, and dangerous hours that they were putting in. An investigative journalist named Dorothy Richardson wrote an expose of the laundry industry in 1905 called The Long Day. And in this work she described a woman who lost a hand in one of the laundry presses. And this is what the woman had to say after her accident. "I was clean done out one Saturday night. I just couldn't see no more. And the first thing I know, whoo, that hand went straight into the rollers. I was just tired, that's all." The most notorious working conditions of all were those in the coal mines. Even today, we occasionally hear stories of a collapse of a mine somewhere, miners being trapped in the coal mines. 100 years ago or more, conditions were far worse, and technologies for trying to rescue anyone trapped in a collapse were much more primitive than they are today. Even on a good day, conditions were abysmal in the mines. Workers would inhale dust and coal all day long, would come up from underground utterly filthy, unused to seeing the light of day. Typically, the vein of coal in the mine was only a few feet tall, and so they had to spend all day crawling or crouched over in order to dig it out or plant the explosives that would open up more of the shaft. And this is to say nothing of the dangers of a mine shaft collapsing or flooding and killing the men trapped inside, which happened with distressing frequency. To resolve a few of these issues, coal mines resorted frequently to hiring young boys who, with their short stature, could scurry down the shafts easier than grown men. These were known as the breaker boys, and their story is among the most tragic of any workers during this time. You see a picture here of the well-known and sad breaker boys. These boys, it was said, never saw the light of day. They went down into the mines when it was still dark in the morning, and by the time they came up at the end of the day, the sun had gone down. And you see in the picture the dirt on their faces. It was very common for these boys to suffer from breathing ailments and lung disease, and many, many of them died tragically young in their lives. There was virtually no system in place to assist or aid any of the workers in these occupations should they be injured, or any kind of help for their families if they were killed. And again, the mining industry was perhaps the most notorious in this regard. The rule in place was that if there were an accident, it was upon the worker to demonstrate that the accident was not his fault, and only if they could prove that it was the business's fault or an accident out of their control would they be paid, or their survivors be paid any kind of compensation. The records of some of these companies provide an interesting glimpse into the thinking at that time. One coal mine in Colorado, for instance, over a 10-year period experienced 90 deaths in their mines. In only one instance out of those 90 was anything paid to the family of the worker who was killed, by demonstrating that the accident was not their fault. The other accounts shed some light onto the ways that these businesses might manipulate the records. Here are some of the coroner's reports of these accidents. Fall of rock due to his own negligence. Broken neck, accident unavoidable. Death by negligence on his own part and no other. Died by a car running over him and his own carelessness. We always see that clause added, that it was the worker's fault, which meant, of course, that the company would have to pay nothing to the family of the killed worker. Under these kinds of conditions and hazards, workers began to realize that their only hope in improving their condition was to unionize, begin to organize and bargain collectively in order to try to improve their condition. And so in the years following the Civil War, we begin to see the first national labor unions springing up. There had been for decades local labor unions or individual factory unions, but now we begin to see broad-based national unions. The first of them was established in 1866 by a man named William Silvis. This was the appropriately titled National Labor Union. It fought for things like equal pay for women and temperance, among a number of other causes. And while it did have some effectiveness, growing to a membership of some 300,000, it essentially began to collapse from within by the early 1870s, torn apart by things like racism and ethnic squabbling, which were very common during this period. Another national union, called the Knights of Labor, was established in 1869 and attempted to address some of the issues that ultimately pulled apart the National Labor Union. It was a very broad-based union. Women and blacks, for instance, were welcome in this union, along with an array of other ethnic groups. Under the leadership of Terence Powderly, the Knights of Labor grew to be the largest union in the country by the 1870s and peaked with a membership of some 700,000 in the year 1886. The Knights of Labor had a very broad array of causes that it fought for, not only working conditions and better hours, but things like the abolition of child labor and temperance and women's rights as well. Additionally, Terence Powderly was opposed to using strikes under the belief that it was a more fair tactic to negotiate openly and try to work through your differences with industry that way. And so we see a few flaws or chinks in the armor of the Knights of Labor. It was essentially too broad in both its membership and in its objectives. It seemed to be diluted a little bit in its attention to any one cause. And the fact that it refused to use strikes to get what it asked for and needed really weakened its leverage in terms of negotiation. Nonetheless, for a decade or more, the Knights of Labor was the most prominent national labor union until it begins to slide and decline in 1886 for reasons we will discuss shortly. In 1881, Samuel Gompers established still another national labor union called the American Federation of Labor, intent on overcoming some of what he perceived of the shortcomings of the Knights of Labor. That is, again, that it was too broad-based and had too broad of an agenda and causes that it was fighting for. And so Gompers' AFL was more focused than the Knights of Labor. Only skilled workers were allowed into the AFL. Only those from trade unions, such as cigar makers, carpenters, iron workers, and so on, were allowed. It also was limited in terms of its membership. Blacks were not allowed, and other minorities were not allowed. It also concentrated its causes to only three. We can almost hear the workers chanting a mantra of hours, wages, and working conditions. It wasn't worried so much with things like temperance and women's rights and the abolition of child labor. It was simply hours, wages, and working conditions. And finally, the AFL, under Gompers' leadership, was not opposed to using strikes when necessary. And in fact, as we will soon see, the AFL did in fact use strikes to some effectiveness during this period. Under these guidelines, the AFL grew to become the largest union in the country and might be considered the first permanent national labor union as it still exists today under the title AFL-CIO. In our pivotal year of 1886, the AFL had a membership of about 140,000. It was certainly a union on the rise by that time. By 1900, the AFL had a membership of more than 1 million.